Madad. My name is Maria Budhwani, and I will be the moderator for today's Critical Conversations. The Critical Conversations series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, in the spirit of social justice, land acknowledgement, and recognizing the history and exploitation of Indigenous peoples, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all speaking from the ancestral lands of the Cherokee and the Muskogee tribes in the Atlanta area. Each of us on this call today are speaking from territories of various Indigenous peoples and tribes, some treated and others, some unceded. We believe the work we do in the sessions like these are part of our ongoing responsibility to acknowledge the ongoing harm that is done to Indigenous peoples on these lands and are working towards a society that is more just, more equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. Today, we are talking about exploring intersectionality. Today's session will provide an opportunity for us to explore the concept of intersectionality, how our identities intersect, and how these intersections can layer further marginalization of certain segments of the population. During this session, you will also see a Q&A box through which you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation. We will do our best to address as many of these questions submitted during today's talk as we can. With that, let me introduce you to our wonderful panelists. We first speak with Dr. Renisa Mawani. Renisa Mawani is a professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia, located on the unceded territories of the Musqueam peoples. She works in the fields of critical theory and colonial legal history and has published widely on law, colonialism, and legal geography. She is the author of Colonial Proximities and Across Oceans of Love, which was a finalist for the UK Socio-Legal Studies Association Theory and History Book Prize in 2020, and the winner of the Association of Asian American Studies Book Prize for Outstanding Contribution to History in 2020. With Isa Hussain, she is the co-editor of The Travels of Law, Indian Ocean Itineraries, published in the Law and History Review. She is also the co-editor of Worlds at Home on Cosmopolitan Futures, published in the Journal of Intercultural Studies in 2019, The Unmooring the Komataga Maru, and the co-editor of Animalia, an anti-imperial bestiary of our times. She has served 2 terms on the editorial board of Law and Society Review, which was recently appointed to the editorial board of the Law and Society Inquiry, and was elected to the Law and Society Association's Board of Trustees. Her current project, Enemies of Empire, seeks to bring late 19th and early 20th centuries of piracy and anti-coloniality into the conversation. Along with Dr. Mawani, we are also joined by Dr. Shelina Karim. Dr. Shelina Karim is a sociologist focusing on critical race and social justice scholarship, and since 2007 has been teaching at the University of Toronto. She has had an extensive experience in both Canada and internationally in senior management roles in organizations in the global development, immigrant settlement, and education sectors. At the Institute of Ismaili Studies, Shelina developed curriculum and led international teacher education initiatives, including the Professional Teacher Educators Program. She has been the executive director of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women and the Saskatoon Open Door Society, and the director for policy and programming at IDERA, a Canadian NGO. As a consultant, Shelina has provided guidance, support, and education sessions to organizations on equity, inclusion, and organizational change. Dr. Qasim is a longtime volunteer, both within the Jamaat and in not-for-profit boards in Canada. She has become a member of the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee for the City of London, the past president, London Intercommunity Health Centre, and a member of the Planning and Allocations Community of the United Way of London and Middlesex. Within the Jamaat, Dr. Qasim has contributed to numerous Jamaati institutions, including ITREB Canada, as a national board member, as a BUI teacher, mentor to STEP teachers, and lead for secondary teacher education. She currently serves on the Council for Canada's National Diversity and Inclusion Portfolio and sits on the Council for Canada's Social Justice Task Force. Thank you both so much for joining us today. We're all excited for the conversation that we are about to have. As we start, we would like to know that the views of our speakers expressed during the course of the discussion are their own. Now let's turn to our conversation to get started. Now let me start with the first question. Dr. Mawani, I'd like to direct this one to you, or at least start off with you. As we begin this conversation, we would first like to get an understanding of how would you define intersectionality? What is it? And why should we be thinking about it?
Thank you so much, Maria. I'd like to thank you and also Farhana Husani for inviting me and Shelina Karim to, I'm thrilled to be in conversation with. And I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm speaking from my home, which is on the unceded territories of the Squamish people. So intersectionality has a long history that is rooted in universities and in higher education. The movement around critical race theory that Shelina will speak to really emerged out of Harvard Law School, and the concerns about a faculty member, Derek Bell, leaving, who was the only Black faculty member, and I think the only faculty member of color at Harvard Law. And this generated an entire movement that has really been quite revolutionary, not just in the university, but also beyond. And intersectionality is really thinking about the ways in which forms of oppression intersect and interlock to produce and have had long-standing sort of historical implications. So how do we think about the intersection, the interrelationality of race, gender, class, sexual orientation, caste, age, ability, disability? These are some of the questions that scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who was part of the critical race movement, has really tried to bring front and center. And the focus is not just on identities, right, but is really about the historical production of systemic forms of oppression. I know that Shelina will elaborate on some of this, and I just want to sort of say that one of the key aspects in my own work is thinking about intersecting histories. So we tend to think of histories of Indian migration, for example, our own family histories as being separate from the dispossession of Indigenous people or from transatlantic slavery. And part of what my work has really tried to bring to the fore is how these histories are actually not separate at all, that they're deeply entangled with one another. And so this is one of the ways that I'm trying to think about intersectionality.
Okay, Dr. Qasim, would you like to go ahead and add to that, please?
Thanks. Thank you, Maria. I also want to thank you for inviting me here. I'm thrilled and really, really gratified to be in this conversation with Renisa, who I have great respect for, and I think we have great spaces for intersection together. I also want to speak to the fact that I am coming also from my home in London, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Oneida Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Munsee Delaware of the Lenape people, the Arawandron, and the Huron-Wendat. And even as we engage in these conversations about equity and justice, I'm very mindful that we're doing it standing and speaking and working from lands of Indigenous communities. And I think we need to be aware and mindful of that. So yes, thank you, Renisa, for that introduction to intersectionality. It is something I want to speak about in terms of understanding intersectionality. I think it's important also to understand the movement for critical race theory, which emerged as a field, as a social movement out of the critical legal studies movement. And Renisa spoke to very well around Derek Bell and the Harvard Law School movement that he was there were no longer, after Derek Bell's departure, there were no longer people of color in that department, and there was a pushback. Critical race theory offers us a way to look at the dynamics of race and racialization as a process, but also more importantly as a system. It's a way to understand the politics of race, law, and power, where the fight for civil rights, the movement for civil rights was speaking to individual cases, but not necessarily speaking to the breadth of the systemic oppressions and marginalizations of different communities. What critical race theory offers us is multiple. It allows us, first of all, to see that race is not about biology. It is about the way in which biology, in this case skin tone and skin color, is used as a tool of power and privilege to systematically and systemically marginalize some and privilege others, right? It allows us to see that race in this context is not about skin color, but how it's become deployed to differentiate people and to differentiate greater or lesser access to resources. A couple of filters that it very definitively offers us, and then I'll move to intersectionality briefly. It offers us a historical lens, so that what we see today is situated not just as a momentary, not just in the contemporary, it situates what's happening in the contemporary through that history of systemic marginalization and privilege. It offers us an intersectional lens, because that way we can nuance and complicate our discussions about race and other forms of oppression, right? As I said earlier, most importantly, perhaps it offers us a systemic lens, so that we understand that issues of oppression and privilege are not just about individual prejudice and discrimination, although those are informed by what by the systems, but it is about how systems operate. Racism, oppression, classism, casteism, homophobia, all of these are systemic ways in which oppression operates, and they operate in intersecting and layered ways. Oppression, I would argue, is produced and reproduced daily, all the time, by our laws, our rules, our codes, our practices, our norms. This is what I call it's built in our societal DNA, right? If you just give an example about Indigenous communities were living on this land for generations. And settlers came and they took the land, they stole the land, and they then developed laws that justify the taker over that land. Those laws are not in the past. Those laws, those codes, those norms continue to affect what we have done for 500 years, right? If you look at the idea that there's systemic disinvestment in communities where there's lots of racialized folks, that is part of how oppression reproduces itself, right? So critical race theory offers us a way to look at these various ideas, these various approaches, these various realities, and situate them historically, situate them in the social movements that is our society. If you look at intersectionality, very much so, Kimberly Crenshaw offered us from 1989, a wonderful way to look at the multiple and layered ways in which oppressions build upon each other, in which they intersect and interlock. It's a theoretical framework where multiple social identities, race, gender, caste, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, disability, ability, all intersect at both the micro level, at the individual experience level, but also they reflect the interlocking systems of power and privilege. It's that relationship that's so important in intersectionality. Intersectionality is rooted in Black feminist scholarship, from Kimberly Crenshaw, but it's not the first time, of course, that these multiple layers were talked about. If you know the name Sojourner Truth, she talked in her speech around Ain't I a Woman, she perhaps the first recorded time where she spoke about these identities of Blackness not reflecting her experience as a Black woman, but also the identity of woman not reflecting her experiences as a Black woman. So these are some of the ideas that are important to intersectionality. I think the idea that identities are not independent, they're not unidimensional, they're multiple and intersecting. We have people from multiple historically oppressed and marginalized groups are being the starting point, so the focal point, and the multiple social identities intersect both at the micro and the societal level. So you have people who experience racial, gendered, socio-class, sexual oppression, also intersecting with these large micro structural factors like poverty, like racism, like sexism. So that interaction is what intersectionality offers us as a very robust way to have conversations about oppression and privilege.
Can I just add one thing? You know, Shelina, I'm so glad that you brought up Sojourner Truth, because as you were talking, I was thinking that my own introduction to thinking sort of intersectionally was through the work of Bell Hooks, who draws on Sojourner Truth to ask the question, which is the title of her book, Ain't I a Woman, right? And that was partly in response to the sort of second wave feminist movement that was really based around the identities and experiences of white women. And then, you know, with Kimberly Crenshaw, we see, and with critical race theory, we see a real concern with, okay, so there's the problem with the white feminist movement that ignores the experiences of Black women, but then there's also the civil rights movement. There's also the sort of struggles around or against anti-Blackness, and how these kinds of struggles also obscure the experiences and the voices of Black women. So I think that is a really good reminder of, you know, that critical race theory, that intersectionality has in fact a very long trajectory that is in part through the experiences of Black women, of Indigenous women, of feminists of color.
Well, that was certainly a strong start right there. I know the audience has quite a bit to start thinking about. So just to sum up before we move on, what you're suggesting is that every individual, whether they are white, whether they are a Black, Indigenous person of color, has multiple identities that essentially explain their experience. So there is not one uniform identity or experience to any particular individual because of their backgrounds and where they come from. Correct?
Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the points that Shelina made that really needs to be underscored is that these identities, the identities that we inhabit and that we lay claims to are in fact historically produced, right? So even you know, we tend to still think about race in very biological ways, despite all of these arguments about race as being socially constructed, but race has a history, a very long history. And so, you know, I think that for me, one of the really important aspects to emphasize is just the historical production of these identities and how they're linked to power, privilege, and underprivilege.
That's great. I'm glad you were heading in that direction, Dr. Mawani, because my next question for you is, what does it mean to have these different identities intersect? I mean, can you give me some examples of such situations, such circumstances?
So I think if we return to the sort of origins of intersectionality and to the writings of Kimberly Crenshaw, a lot of Black feminists, including Crenshaw, were really making observations that were linked to their own personal experiences, right? So the sort of feminist slogan, "The personal is political," is all about sort of emphasizing one's personal circumstances and experiences. But what's really useful about intersectionality is to think about how these personal experiences are actually produced through historical systems that have a very long history. So Shelina gave the example of Indigenous people and the laws that have been established to justify dispossession and theft of land, right? One of the sort of key pieces of legislation is around the Indian Act and how that continues to exist in Canada. And how that has deeply shaped and affected the experiences of Indigenous people, of Indigenous women, right, who is considered to be a status and a non-status Indian in Canada. So we need to think about these personal and experiential aspects of intersectionality in these bigger systems of law, of politics, of social life. And I think one of the places where we really see these different intersecting identities is around many of the social movements that we've seen emergent, right? So this is, very significant in the Black Lives Matter movement, in the struggles around the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the kinds of solidarities that different communities have expressed with Indigenous people or with Black communities globally around Black Lives Matter. And to sort of bring it back to the experiential and to the personal, we see this, we might describe ourselves as brown women, all three of us on the screen, but we still come from very different backgrounds. We are all Muslim, but what about women who are queer or who don't identify as women per se? What about issues around class and ability and so on and so forth? And I think one of the very sort of concrete places we see this emerging is around personal pronouns, right? And this has become an issue that's been really sort of politicized in recent years. And this is where we see these sort of issues of identity, experience, and systemic oppression intersecting, if you will.
Okay, if you don't mind, Dr. Mawani, I know you just mentioned the pronouns, so I know some in our audience may not be completely familiar with it. If you wouldn't mind just going over that a little bit more to make sure we have a clarification for them.
Sure. So there are clear differences between sexuality and gender identity. And none of us have our pronouns here on our Zoom IDs. I usually do, but I don't know, it never seems to save. But people may be, I identify as she, her, hers. People might identify as they, them. People might identify as gender fluid. So there are a range of personal pronouns that people use to identify themselves. And part of this has to do with the limits of language, right? People may not necessarily identify with the binary of he or she. Individuals might feel more comfortable identifying as they, or may identify as she, they, or he, they. And these gender identities are interrelated, but distinct from sexuality. Shelina, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
That's actually a great description of the relationship between gender sexuality and gender identity and sexuality. I think that's a great example, Renisa. I think, the issue of personal pronouns is something that folks you're right, it's becoming intensely political, but it's also a space where folks are feeling hopefully more comfortable to say, these binaries don't speak to my experiences, and this is who I am. And language constrains that. I have had lots of conversations with people around pronouns where I use normally I also have personal my pronouns on my Zoom screen and didn't save, but I use it on my email signature. And a lot of people have questioned that and said, well, why? Because you're identifying as she, her, and hers. Why is that an important thing to do? And for me, it's important because in a space where I am cisgender, where my gender identity matches the gender I was assigned at birth, I am in a position of privilege. And as a person who has privilege, I want to stand in solidarity and normalize the use of personal pronouns so that it becomes something that we all do all the time. Much as we say, hi, I'm Shelina, we can normalize that idea so that it becomes easier and more, it becomes perhaps just a little bit easier for folks who don't identify cisgender to be able to speak about their pronouns and bring pronouns that are more in keeping with their own experience about who they are. Right? And we want people to be able to bring who they are to this. That's one of the things that intersectionality helps us do. But in terms of the broader question, for me, Renisa did a great job of talking about, look, we might all identify as South Asian women and as Muslim, but our experiences are different because we have different, perhaps class backgrounds, different family backgrounds, different immigration experiences, different current situations. So the intersectionality allows us to nuance and complicate our conversation so that we can actually see those multiple layers, so that I'm not able to then say, Renisa, I don't understand what you're speaking about because that doesn't speak to my identity as a South Asian woman, right? Or a Muslim woman, or an Ismaili Muslim woman. It allows us to have a greater nuance and depth to our conversation, that I can recognize Renisa's experience or experiences, or yours, Maria's, or anybody else's that we're speaking to, and understand with compassion, with empathy, with acceptance that somebody else's experience may not speak to mine, right? Or mine are different. It allows us to explore those layers of meaning and identity of others and ourselves. I think what's interesting to me is when we look at intersectionality, I talked a little bit about it not being unidimensional, identities not being unidimensional, but they're being multiple and layered. Not looking at identities in that multiple layered way can be very, it is very exclusionary, but it can also be violent, all right? Just to give you some examples, in Canada, we've had over 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women that police didn't actually think about because the assumption was their identity as sex workers put them in a particular way, and they were not either as addicts or as sex workers. Police were not watching. Police just assumed because they looked at them as in a unidimensional way without looking at the layers. Indigenous women and girls went missing. In Toronto's gay village, there were for years racialized gay men that were going missing, and there were assumptions being made about who they were and why they were missing. Maybe they're, whatever the assumptions were by police forces. They didn't actually start taking it seriously or looking until a white man went missing. There is violence associated with not looking at that layered and nuanced way at how individuals and systems interact, right? So I just wanted to kind of broaden that conversation as well to talk about what happens when we don't actually look at intersectionality. Do we participate in both an erasure, which we do, but also both physical and systemic violence where we become complicit in those systems?
Can I just add one thing? So I think, one of the limits of how intersectionality was originally sort of discussed was really just around race and not around colonialism, right? And so what we've seen since, the 90s is a real effort to think more systematically about colonialism. And we can see the ways in which, of course, race as a biological marker is part of this, has been part of this colonial project and the rise of scientific racism, but we can also say that about personal pronouns, right? So if we think about the writings of Indigenous feminists and two-spirited people, I mean, one of the arguments is that the binaries between he and she are colonial impositions that many communities outside of Europe didn't actually use to identify themselves. So I think, you know, what's been really sort of productive and useful around the ways in which intersectionality has been reimagined and the way in which we're thinking about the intersection of identities is the way in which colonialism has really been foregrounded as an important part of this discussion and this context.
Absolutely. I'm glad that both of you did mention, you know, intersectionality to that degree and colonialism, because as, you know, all of us as members of a faith community, particularly one that's generally in the minority, you know, it really begs us to ask the question, why should faith communities in general be concerned about ideas of intersectionality? And how do these intersecting identities create additional marginalization of communities and individuals within these communities? If you wouldn't mind, Dr. Qasim, since you had quite the bit to speak about that.
Sure. Many reasons that we should be concerned about intersectionality. I'll start at our level and then work away. You know, as Muslim communities, we have always been marginalized and excluded. Right? It has a long history, not just since 9/11 as would be imagined, but it's been a long Orientalist history of marginalization. But particularly since 9/11 in North America, there's been a constant positioning of Muslims as racialized, as others. Muslims as racialized, not necessarily just ethnically, but racialized as Muslims. The idea that Muslims look and think and act a certain way. Now we all know that that's not accurate. It's not a simplistic, but the simplistic box is sort of put around us. And as we are struggling against those layers of racism, of oppression, of Islamophobia, of integration into our communities and our societies, there's often the senses of exclusion that develop in us, the need to perhaps not upset the apple cart, to position ourselves appropriately, quote unquote, appropriately, right? And as a result, sometimes what we do is we tend to essentialize differences within communities, right? So we essentialize our experiences to being good Muslims or model minorities, or what I term acceptable Muslims in the Canadian and the United States, in the American nation state. So as a result, we kind of position ourselves in a particular way. It's important that we're aware of intersectionality so that we're not participating in erasure and silencing either within our communities or within society. I think it's really important for us as Muslims to address intersectionality and all of these questions around social justice and colonialism and imperialism, because it is our call to action as Muslims. It's really, really important that we understand this is not new stuff. These are conversations and call to actions that we've been participating in for generations since Islam was revealed. Right? If you look at the Quran, it tells us very clearly that we are the human being is the Khalifa of God, the deputy, the steward of society and of the environment. It is our responsibility as Muslims to build a better world. Certainly, we see that in the world in which we live. In our context, that the Ismaili Constitution asks us to contribute to the making of better societies in which we live. This is our calling. For anybody who says to me this is new, I would seek to engage in that conversation. Say, tell me how it's new. Right? The specific language perhaps is something that we are working to understand, the specific social movements that have evolved and shifted in ways that we are perhaps a little bit less familiar with, but that doesn't give us a pass. we need to actually engage and participate.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that, you know, one of the enormous strengths, but also challenges of our community globally is that we come from so many different countries and regions of the world, speak different languages, have different histories. And oftentimes, you know, we may not necessarily be attuned to the kinds of challenges that Ismailis in Syria or in Pakistan or in other places in the world have had to endure, right? And so part of, I think, what intersectionality invites us to do is to listen and to sort of question and to think about the ways in which, even though we may be part of a community, we might be, you know, we're all Shia Muslim Ismailis, that we still come from very different histories of trauma, histories of war, histories of resilience and struggle. And so I think that that is certainly one reason why we should, you know, be concerned about intersectionality, because of how it really deeply connects to our own histories and experiences. But I also want to say that I think we've inherited a certain way of thinking about identity, about community, about history. And, you know, one of the really amazing things that has happened in the last decade is that scholars have become increasingly attuned to the ways in which the transatlantic slave trade is, in fact, a history of Islam, right? So there, in 2017, the Library of Congress obtained an Arabic language autobiography by Omar ibn Said, who was 37 years old when he was taken from West Africa, transported to Charleston, South Carolina as a slave. Or, you know, a recent book that I read talked about the fact that slave revolts happened on Laylatul Qadr, right? Because enslaved people were sort of watching the moon and calculating when that day would arrive, and that a revolt on the night of power would have, you know, would be successful, right? Would yield successful results. So just to give one example, instead of thinking about the relationship between, or thinking about Black Lives Matter as something that's somehow unrelated or not important to our community, we might think about these shared histories, right? And we might also think about how patterns and experiences of migration have brought many of us to Canada, where land is unceded, where Indigenous people are struggling to, you know, to survive, and what is our responsibility and our obligations to those struggles as Ismailis, and you know, as Shelina pointed out, as Ismailis who are encouraged to be stewards and are encouraged to engage with issues around social justice.
Can I just add something, Maria? Thank you, Renisa. That's amazing. You're absolutely right, because intersectionality offers us to look both at our own community and outside and look at the shared histories. You're absolutely right in saying that when we, you know, communities within the Jamaat that have historically not had regular contact with institutional structure, we are now coming more and more into contact with each other. And as those conversations, as those interactions are occurring, intersectionality offers us a tool to ensure that we are looking at people in the wholeness of their own identities, but their shared histories and our shared histories with them. You know, so what about, how do we look at the histories and the people who've come from other parts of the world that have historically not had contact with institutions? How do we look at Black Ismaili Muslims? Both those that are within our community, but also those who increasingly, as Ismaili Muslims are marrying or having partnering out with other non-Ismailis, some of them are marrying Blacks, either Muslims or non, but how do we have those conversations around how does Black Lives Matter matter to us as Ismaili Muslims? So it matters in the contemporary context, but also matters in that shared historical context. So thank you for that, Renisa.
Absolutely. Well, that's it's interesting because with each of the aspects that both of you mentioned, and it's inevitable, it seems like there has to be some sort of reconciliation between how we're Ismailis or Muslims in a very local, regional, or national sense, and then how we relate to each other globally. Would you mind elaborating on that, Dr. Kassam?
So, sorry, repeat that question, Maria, please.
How would we reconcile our own intersection, our own experiences as Ismaili Muslims, and at least in our case, in the Western Americas, in developed countries, in Canada and the US, versus Ismailis that may be in different parts of the world, and as you mentioned, in Syria, in Tajikistan, in East Africa. How do we have to take a look at how what we may do, may not necessarily be what Ismailis whom we do relate to. They may behave differently. They may think things differently. How do we recognize the differences in these identities that we say we do share, but there are obviously differences?
Yeah, so thank you for that. Yeah, I think the first thing we need to be aware of is to listen. The first step is actually hearing what folks are telling us, to not start from the presumption. If I'm talking to somebody, to having a conversation, to actually understand that my history, my perspective, my identity, my opinions are one of many and one of multiple. They're not necessarily the right way, they're just one way. And that if I hear folks, if I understand the histories that folks are coming to this table with, it may be easier to actually understand those differences. I think the idea that as an Ismaili Muslim community, we all have to have the same experience or share or have the same opinion is something that I'd like to challenge. I think there is multiple ways to think, multiple experiences that brings a richness and a robustness to the community that I think it would be a shame to lose that. So this idea, first of all, the idea is to listen. I think we have to contend also with issues of privilege and power. We have to recognize that some of us have had greater access to resources, have had greater access to privilege, have had greater access to institutional connections, right? In terms of having access to institutional what's the word I'm looking for? Not connections, but be more familiar with the institutional structure. I think we have to contend with those issues of power and privilege, because without contending with those issues of power and privilege, we tend to neutralize and say we're all coming to it from the same place. We're not. We have different spaces, different access to resources and privilege. And once I contend with my own privilege, then it becomes easier for me to hear, to listen, to contend with that difference, but also perhaps to use my privilege to speak and broaden the conversation, to perhaps amplify voices of those who have been historically marginalized.
Do you think that, since you're mentioning, that there is obviously a level of privilege, and we can all recognize that there is, what do you think about the resistance to this engagement to try to develop our own identities, but to understand one another? Do you find that there is a resistance, and why do you think that might be there? And please, Dr. Mawani, feel free to add in.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's often a resistance among, especially sort of older members of the community, to feel like they don't want to be, maybe, they don't want to be overly political, or, they don't want to become involved in issues around social justice that are really, really intensely politicized. And I think that one of the sort of our imam's encouragement is to think about education as a lifelong process, right? And we might think about this education not necessarily in the formalistic sense, although all you young people out there, you should get multiple degrees. But I just mean, like, how does one educate oneself? And if we think of this as a lifelong process, then I think part of our responsibility that we're encouraged to do by our imam is to, educate ourselves about the places in which we live, about the kinds of, political contentions, the kinds of, the ways in which communities and societies are fractured, and how, as Shelina said, how should we be using our voices, especially for those people who are privileged and who have had the benefit of institutional resources in places that they live? How do we actually use our voices to share this knowledge, to open up conversations, to encourage other people, to draw people out and say, well, this isn't just about this political issue that you should be engaged with, but you should think about how this political issue is one that really affects us as a global community. So I see this as, I recognize the resistance, and I don't want to condemn it. I think that for many people, these kinds of questions are ones that are well beyond their comfort zone. But I tell my students and my children that if you're not uncomfortable, then you are not learning. So, so learning is difficult. It's a uncomfortable process. And, we may not realize how much we've transformed in our thinking and our approach. But I think that those processes are only possible if we do try to seek out knowledge and do try to learn and do try to educate ourselves about things that are happening around us. Or, why is Black Lives Matter an important global movement? Why should we be concerned about the effects of COVID on Black, Indigenous, and people of color? Why are personal pronouns a significant issue that we should be engaging with? And we have so many resources available to us that we can, in fact, do that self-learning ourselves. And I think that those kinds of conversations also are ones that are encouraged by our imam about, knowing where we live and what our obligations and responsibilities are.
I'd like to actually thank you, Renisa, for that. And I'd like to add something around resistance. You're absolutely right, Renisa. I think there's a presumption that some of these issues are too political. And I want to actually question the presumptions, because I think by illuminating some of the assumptions underneath those sorts of conversations, I also don't want to condemn the resistance. I think resistance comes when people are unfamiliar and out of their comfort zones. So what I'd like to do is sort of perhaps illuminate some of those assumptions. I want to first distinguish between political and partisan. Partisan is where we take stands on particular political parties or particular political candidates. Political, I want to take sort of question and challenge that a little bit. Sometimes social justice movements are labeled too political because their aims are viewed as quote unquote controversial. I think we have to start from the presumption that in this material world, human beings cannot claim to know objective truth. We can have access to glimpses, but objectivity is something that I want to sort of challenge. All claims are interpretations that are made from particular positions with our intersectional identities, our class background, our racial background, our socioeconomic status, our sexuality. All of those come with a particular set of biases and ways in which to look at the world. So when we espouse views that are supposedly ostensibly apolitical, let's ask ourselves, what are we doing? We are in fact, inadvertently perhaps, but we are in fact reinforcing those positions that are taken for granted, usually because they become hegemonic. In other words, they become dominant in a particular social context through historical and ongoing domination, through colonization, through all the systems of oppression we spoke about. In other words, when we take positions or when we don't take positions, we sometimes, perhaps inadvertently, align ourselves with power and privilege, which is in effect a very narrow set of values, right? Our decision in some ways to remain apolitical as individuals is actually quite the opposite. It actually normalizes and depoliticizes those ways of being that unfairly advantage some over others, right? So, for example, in recent months, this has been the case for a long time. But in recent months, it's become very clear that calling the police, particularly on racialized people or Black folks, is an intensely political and threatening act for some, even if we don't see it that way, right? Calling certain ideas and certain movements too political has risky implications. If, for example, we characterize the Black Lives Movement as being too quote unquote political, are we implying inadvertently again, perhaps not, but inadvertently at least, are we implying that Black lives are too politically charged for our community, for our attention and our advocacy as individuals, as Ismailis, as Muslims? Similarly, in characterizing indigenous struggles for sovereignty as quote unquote too political, are we also deeming their struggles unworthy of our consideration and our support? So we need to be really clear about what we're talking about as individuals, as we seek to look at these movements of social justice. How do we reconsider, how do I reconsider for myself, for my family, what is considered too political, rather than so that I don't inadvertently or consciously or unconsciously reaffirm and become complicit in perspectives that are rooted in power and privilege. So I just kind of wanted to add that a little bit to talk a little bit about resistance.
I'm glad you bring that up, because if we're taking a look at what both of you have mentioned, it's obviously the color of our skin, and we've recognized that Ismailis do have lots of different skin colors. We're not limited to one. We're in lots of geographical locations around the world with lots of different backgrounds and immigration experiences, whatever we've gone through growing up. So how do we take this idea of intersectionality and reconcile what our faith is teaching us? How do we put that together and figure out what's going on?
You're asking me or Renisa or both? Do you want to go first, Renisa, or do you want me to start then?
Well, I think one of the so my partner who is here on this call, in this webinar, Riaz, hi Riaz, used to teach BUI for many, many years. And one of the things that I actually found really useful and productive about the lessons, the BUI lessons, is just how far back historically the curriculum went, right? And so there is, and the real sort of emphasis on pluralism, that Ismailis come from different places, that we have this, that we are part of this very rich history of global Islam. And I think, and these are really, really important and useful lessons that that the Imam is still really emphasizing in his work, and also in his firmans to the Jamaat. But I think, if we think about sort of intersectionality in terms of a longer sort of historical trajectory, I think what, we've seen this very rich and diverse and pluralistic Islam, right, that sort of spanned many regions of the world, different religious and linguistic practices, different forms of art, so on and so forth. But something really sort of, I think, changed in the context of the, people identify 1492, we can, in Columbus's voyage to the so-called discovery of the New World. But there was something very radically, European colonialism radically transformed the world over hundreds of years, right? And so that's where we really see the calcification of certain kinds of identities and of the imposition of, forms of, or ideas of civility and savagery of, that's where we really see a kind of legacy that we're still grappling with today. And so I think if we think about the, I don't want to over romanticize these sort of worlds prior to colonialism, but, one of the areas that I work on is the Indian Ocean, and we can think about the sort of rich movements of people of religious practices of Muslims going from all over the world to do Hajj, and how that dramatically changed when Europeans began encroaching in that territory in the 15th and 16th centuries. And so, you know, without romanticizing what came before, I think it's important to realize just how dramatically that shifted and changed with European colonialism. So I don't actually see these as antithetical. I think that they're very much about different historical moments, and, you know, and we can never sort of go back to what happened pre-colonial times, but I think even learning these histories of what was possible, of the kinds of solidarities that communities had with one another, you know, the ways in which people coexisted as Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, prior to the arrival of the British in India, for example. I think that these are really useful lessons of these very rich communities, and, you know, of what can still be, right? If we are able to sort of think about these impositions of identity, these impositions of oppression, and the ways in which they affect us so dramatically today. And I think Shelina is going to give us more insights on this.
Well, I think you've done a great job, Renisa. Look, I think for me, the two are inextricably linked. This is a matter of faith. If we believe in pluralism, then it should make us deeply disturbed to see oppression in any form, whether it's racism against Black, Indigenous, and racialized people, classism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, all of those socioeconomic status, all of these forms of injustice. Any of these forms of injustice, oppression, should be calls to action for us as Muslims. Pluralism cannot exist, cannot thrive in an environment which tolerates any sort of oppression. You know, it's interesting, the Imam has actually made that clear in an interview he did a number of years ago. He was asked about equity and how does equity work with civil society and pluralism. And he said very clearly, if you don't have equity, you don't have a functioning pluralist society. You don't have institutions that function well and equitably and pluralistically. So he's very clearly told us that, right? We, in our own lives as Muslims, as a community, I don't think that we should be able to legitimate any form of oppression. You know, yes, I know that there's resistance, and we need to work with that and figure out a way forward. But whether we come from different generations, whether we come from different upbringings, differences of opinions, you know, I want us to build a culture of accountability, that we actually are responsible for our words, our actions, or our silence and our complicity in the face of oppression. One of the things, I love that Renisa talked to young people and said, I think young people are leaders in this. And I was asked recently to do some work for ITREB Canada for a young adult session. And I said, look, I'm not a young adult. And they smiled and said, oh, no, that's okay. And, I pointed to my gray hair. And one of my sons said to me, it's as important to hear older people like you speak the words of justice as it is for younger people to speak them. So it's important for all of us to have these intergenerational conversations as a function of our faith. We need to take responsibility for the type of community and society that we are creating and maintaining every day. I want us to actually get to a situation where we are, and I don't use the word tolerance or intolerant very often. There's a whole reason behind that, why I don't use it, but I'm going to use it today. We need to be completely intolerant of any form of oppression. And that I would argue that these ideas are deeply grounded in our faith. And, the Imam in his La Fontaine One World speech, he talked about, he said these beautiful words. He says, pluralism is a kaleidoscope that history shakes every day, meaning it's constantly evolving and changing and fluid. It's dynamic. He also speaks very clearly about a diversity of diversities and a pluralism of pluralism, pointing the way forward that it's not one thing. It's multiple, it's multi-layered, it's complex. We need to contend with it every day.
So the question now we have to ask ourselves is, what can we actively do as individuals, both young and old, as members of the Ismaili community, to actually have these kinds of discussions, right? Have this kind of growth and learning? What is it that we can do?
So sure, go ahead, Renisa, you go first.
Go ahead, please.
All right. So I think, the first thing we need to do is educate ourselves, right? I think Renisa spoke powerfully about the idea that we need to understand and hear the experiences of peoples, their histories, their places where they have experienced oppression, places where they've got privilege. We need to actually hear people in their words, in their language, and educate ourselves about the issues. So when somebody says to us, I feel that I've been excluded in a particular way, hear what they're saying, understand what they're saying. When somebody says to us, or when you read the headline saying, we want to defund police, let's educate ourselves in finding out why that is and what's being argued for, right? So learn about these issues that are affecting marginalized communities, help us understand those arguments. These are principles that we uphold, right? Listen to young people, listen to community groups that are speaking about all forms of oppression, racism, homophobia, sexism. Let's use this time to grow and to learn and to reflect. Renisa talked about uncomfortable conversations and uncomfortable moments of learning. We call it productive discomfort. Let's get to a point of productive discomfort that we feel this uncomfortable because we're not uncomfortable, we're not learning, but it's productive because it then spurs us to change our own, to reflect on ourselves, to reflect on people close to us, on communities to which we belong, reflect on our words, our actions, our thoughts, listen to folks along the way. I'd like to continue to see conversations like this, continue, because I think it's important for people to have spaces, curated, safer spaces that they can have these conversations. I often talk about the cognitive dissonance that I experienced, because in the community, particularly because I've been involved in the community for many, many decades. We won't say how many, but there was times where I would have these conversations around justice where sometimes it was a lonely conversation. And so I learned to live in cognitive dissonance because I wanted to be connected to the Jamaat. In my work life, in my academic life, in my readings, in my conversations outside those spaces, I was able to do and say anything I wanted to, and I felt comfortable doing. Within the Jamaat, I began to temper my language sometimes. And I speak very frankly about my own experiences. I can't speak to anybody else's, but that's been my experience. For the first time in my adult life, I'm finding these voices coming together in these conversations like this, which are gratifying. But I want to point out that cognitive dissonance is not a healthy place and a healthy way to live. It is not healthy for young people to live in that cognitive dissonance. I don't want young people in particular to feel that they can't bring these conversations within these spaces in the Jamaat. It's also not sustainable for young people today because there are movements happening. And I think it's important that young people continue to participate in those movements. So that's sort of my conversation around what next.
I guess, just to add to that, I mean, many people have been struggling over the last 9 or 10 months because of COVID, because of curfews and lockdowns, because of perhaps working from home or not working at all. And I think that, these are difficult times. I don't want to diminish that, but I also think that this is an opportunity for us to spend time learning about, what's happening around us, about, why should we care about Indigenous struggles for sovereignty, or why should we care about Black Lives Matter, or even to learn something about our own history, right? And so I think that, I remember sort of at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement and protests in the summer, people were saying, oh, what should I do? What should I do? And many young people who are engaged in these movements were saying, well, you need to take responsibility to educate yourself, right? And you need to be taking some initiative to learn things. And so I think that that is a really important lesson that we should be taking away from those conversations that were happening in and are still happening. And, as Shelina said, I think that these are intergenerational conversations. I can't tell you how much I've learned from my own children and the kinds of things that they have discussed with me, but also from my parents, right? And from my elders, and the ways in which, they provide very useful reminders about the fact that many of these questions are not new. Many of the struggles that we're witnessing today are actually not new, right? That they have had to struggle against homophobia, racism, colonialism, being, in positions of privilege and power in Africa, for example, amidst majority, Black community. And so I think that these are important lessons. And then the final thing I'll say is that we're in a moment where there are so many questions about what the future of life on this planet will be, that we can't actually afford to, recede into identities and into our own insular communities. We need to think about how we can actually be part of a much larger movement that addresses questions of planetary crisis and climate catastrophe. And I would say that there's also a lot of research coming out about COVID and its link to the ways in which we've changed the planet. So there's so much to learn, and there's so much to process, and there's so much to discuss.
So thank you so much, both of you. So now we're heading towards the end of our session. And we do have a few questions from the audience. And for those of you who are in the audience, feel free to ask more questions in the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to them as best as possible. So thank you, first for all of those very insightful, very reflective answers that have certainly given us a lot of food for thought. I'm going to go ahead and head in straight into the questions so we can try to get them taken care of. Now, the first one is for you, Dr. Mawani. I'd like to hear Dr. Mawani elaborate more on how the pandemic has led to the exacerbation of certain systems of oppression. I'm thinking particularly about her 2020 article about anti-Chinese racism and settler colonialism in the context of COVID.
Thank you so much. I don't want to take up too much of the time here to answer the question, except to say that, what we're seeing is how COVID has had a disproportionate effect on Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And we see this in a variety of different ways, right? We see this in terms of, which communities experience complications and higher rates of death. We're seeing this in the rise of anti-Chinese racism, which according to the Vancouver Police has increased, I think, 870% since the same time last year in Vancouver. We're seeing it in reports of Indigenous people who are not getting adequate care in hospitals and who are essentially being left to die in emergency rooms. So I think that we're seeing these intensifications of inequality, of violence, essentially, but we can't think of this in the context of the pandemic only, right? We have to think about the ways in which these have been produced over a long historical period. And there are wonderful resources available. One of my favorite books that I read as a graduate student was Mary Ellen Kelm's Colonizing Bodies, about the ways in which settler colonialism has essentially changed the biology of Indigenous people, right? And how we're seeing that today is in high rates of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, all of these other very preventable illnesses that have been produced through the theft of land and the legal restrictions on hunting and fishing.
That's quite insightful. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to go into a couple more questions. And let's see. So it looks like, as a Smileys, do we reinforce the stereotypes about the broader Muslim Ummah by talking about ourselves as a different or as a model minority group, like Dr. Qasim had mentioned? How do we go about moving this particular needle within our own culture and community in terms of equity?
Sure, I'll take a crack first. That's a great question. Yes. Now, I think, again, I want to situate this in the context of our own history, right? We've come to North America as relatively recent immigrants. Our focus was on ensuring that our families had food, access to education, shelter, housing, etc. So I want to situate it in that context. And in that context, the need at that time was felt to be, let's integrate, let's make sure that our families are well settled. So I want to first contextualize that. Having said that, I think what sometimes happens is, yes, because we have some discomfort around this. We have some discomfort because we also have experienced marginalization both in society and within the Muslim Ummah. As a result, we sometimes negotiate those paths very, very carefully, sometimes perilously, right? Because we're not quite sure how to handle it. And yes, sometimes we do position ourselves as what I call the acceptable Muslim, the Muslim that is situated as one that stands, how I position it is, stands at the boundaries of the nation state, justifying the exclusion of the other. And in some cases, that other are Muslims that are the Muslims that are deemed to be too dangerous, too threatening. And as a result, we become complicit in those systems. And I'd like us to actually think consciously and intentionally about how we're doing that and how we can open up in the interest of equity. Again, I ask ourselves to think about the language we're using, the conversations we're having, the learning we're doing about what makes us, why equity is crucial to all of us. And equity is about actually making sure that everybody at the table is being treated fairly and with equity, to not participate in the exclusion of others. So do we sometimes position ourselves as model minorities? Yes, we do. We participate also, and we are positioned in that way for a variety of reasons. The first step for me is that awareness to understand that that's how we often have either been positioned or position ourselves, to be self-conscious about that and to intentionally learn and broaden our understanding.
Okay. Well, then I guess this leads into the next question that we had gotten was, a lot of this will create a level of fear and obviously some level of discomfort. So how do we move beyond empathy to the next steps in this time of extreme hypervisibility, which brings our own fear and resistance, especially when considering the intergenerational misunderstandings, learning curves? Dr. Mawani?
So I think, I think fundamentally we need to really think about the kind of world we want to live in, right? Everything that's good in the world takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of courage. And so I think part of what we need to think about is like, what kind of world do we want to inhabit? Yesterday, when we talked, Shelina was saying that in the teachings of the Prophet and the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, that, that caring for the sick, the poor, the needy was an integral part of, of how we were to exist in the world. And those challenges haven't gone away, but they've expanded exponentially in many ways. And so I think that, that is a really important ethos of our religion, of our sense of community. And I think that we need to actually think really seriously about, what kind of planet we want to live on, and how we can maintain life in a sustainable and compassionate way.
Fantastic. So we have time for just one more question, but before we move on, we are posting some of the resources that both Dr. Mawani and Dr. Qasim had mentioned. So do keep an eye out on your chat, and you'll be able to get some of those resources and links over there. Now, as to our last question, and I know Dr. Mawani, you've mentioned quite a bit about Black Lives Matter, so this might be more directed towards you, but does intersectionality reduce the ability of movements to achieve gains? And must one necessarily ignore some elements of identity and experience in order to achieve broader objectives. For example, Black transgender activists were significant during the BLM movement, but have since been marginalized in achieving progress against their own goals versus those of the broader movement.
I'm so glad that somebody asked that question. So the first thing that I'd like to say is that, I think there have been many critiques of intersectionality, which I think are really important to keep in mind. So my own, one of my own mentors in graduate school, Shireen Razak, preferred to talk about interlocking oppressions as opposed to intersectionality, right? Because it really gets to the question of power, of privilege. So that's the first thing. The second is, I think that, we can't expect that that communities who are deeply committed to social justice are somehow exempt from or are somehow outside of power relations. And I think that the kinds of tensions and pressures that we see around and the kind of discrimination and violence that we see directed at trans people are not, community organizations or social movements like Black Lives Matter or any other are not, in fact, exempt from those. So I think that, these are, and there isn't a quick fix or a quick answer. I think a lot of this requires sort of a reflection, a interrogation, a questioning, a listening, a challenging, and an opening or an openness to being challenged. And so, even when social movements seem to be gaining visibility and seem to be, gaining currency, that doesn't mean that that's the end of the struggle or the end of the discussion, right? In many cases, that's really about the beginning. It's about pointing to the kinds of invisibilities or the kinds of erasures or the kinds of violences that might be manifesting themselves in different ways. And so, I think that for all communities, for all politically committed communities, that this kind of constant reflection and questioning is part of what social movements and social justice movements are really about and need to be invested in.
Yeah, and I just actually like to add, absolutely, Renisa, I completely agree with what you've just said. We have to be careful, even in social movements for justice, that we don't replicate complicities and erasure and the patterns of power and privilege, right? And I don't think anybody intends that, but I think the idea is that we have to be constantly watching ourselves and constantly challenging ourselves and each other to make sure that our goals are equity for all. Is justice for all, not for some of us. Angela Davis says that human rights they're indivisible. You can't argue for justice for some, just as individuals. She said you can't argue for justice for some and not for others. It doesn't work that way. So we have to constantly be working towards the type of society we want, where equity and justice are for all of us. So even in social movements for justice, I would hope and I would encourage us all to actually be thinking about the voices that are either not at the table or are being silenced or erased, and making sure as much as we can that we constantly challenging ourselves to ensure that those voices are being heard, their experiences are being heard.
Excellent, excellent. So we're heading right about at the end of our time. So if there is anything in particular that either of you would like to end with or add on, please, feel free to do so. And for those that are on, for this entire conversation, please look forward to more information about it on the d.ismaili/USA webpage and social media pages for our next one and copies of this particular conversation. And you'll also be getting a survey at the end of this conversation that we would really appreciate that you would fill out so we can bring better programs for you. So Dr. Mawani, how about you start?
I just, somebody wrote a final question in the Q&A, which I think is a really important one. In one sentence, what message could you give to older generation and the younger generation to come on the same page? I'm not good at giving one sentence answers, but I will try. And that is to say that, we all tend to think, young people think that they know everything. Older people think that we know everything. Our elders think that they know everything. And part of I think a strategy would be to have a conversation where we're each able to bring these insights to, exchange with one another. Our elders have been in the world much longer than we have and seen things that we haven't seen. And yet, some of the most profound insights, as I've said earlier, I've taken from my children and from conversations that I've had with them.
Yeah, I was going to also do the same thing because that's a brilliant question. I also am not very good at one sentences, but I'll try. Yes, absolutely. To understand that knowledge, whatever we think we know, knowledge is never complete. It is always incomplete and partial and dynamic and moving. So actually have those conversations with each other in the spirit of compassion and understanding and openness and acceptance, to say, maybe this person has something to teach me that I didn't think about before. Like Renisa, I've learned a lot, both from my children, who constantly challenge me to think differently or to push the limits of my thinking, and my parents, who have in their own lives been involved in movements for justice, right? So I think those conversations, to enter those conversations with empathy and understanding and openness, knowing that truth and knowledge are always in interpretation and incomplete and partial and dynamic. That would be a huge step.
Excellent. Thank you so much for both of you for joining. It was a very enlightening conversation, and you've certainly given us a lot of information to really think about, both in terms of how we interact with the world and how we view ourselves and how we interact with the world. So thank you again. We appreciate all the insight and the help that you've given us. And thank you to the audience today for joining us. Hopefully, this is just the start of our critical conversations. And today was such a treat for me, as I hope it was for all of you who are watching. Thank you again.